Everybody. So today's video is going to be a bit more free form, but it's on a topic that's very important to me, which is Vipassana meditation. As I'm sure some of you saw, I recently had a dialogue with my friend and mentor and colleague, Evan Thompson, about meditation and philosophy. And I thought it would be good to post a video where I get into a little bit some of my own particulars about meditation practice, the kind of meditation I do, some of the benefits, some of the pitfalls, and to address sort of two questions that have been coming up for me lately. In particular, had a number of people in the context of conversations about meditation tell me that I'm not very good at meditation. I'm not good at mindfulness. And which always struck me as a really interesting claim that people make that's based on a very task-focused conception of what meditation is. So I want to talk a bit about that, and then also a little bit about what I would otherwise call subtle phenomena that start to become salient to one's awareness if an individual really engages rigorously in a course of meditation, and some of the challenges that can come up around what I'll call subtle phenomena. I'll unpack that in a bit. But to begin, I guess I just wanted to lay out a bit of background on my own meditation practice and the tradition that I work in, and talk a little bit about that. So I've been practicing Vipassana meditation in the householder tradition that was popularized by S.N. Goenka and his teacher Asaji Ubukin for about 15 years. So I took my first 10-day silent meditation retreat back in my mid-undergraduate 14, 15 years ago, and really just had a very profound transformative experience on the basis of that first 10-day course, and went back to my life after that first 10-day course, quite changed, but kind of just sunk back into old habits and living the life I've been living for about a year. And then a year went by, and after that year, I went back and I did 2 more 10-day retreats in quick succession within a month of each other. And by the end of that third retreat, I had made a strong determination to completely give up all drugs and alcohol and really dedicate myself to the practice of Vipassana, which I've continued to do for the last decade and a half. Having sat a number of retreats of various lengths, and as a result, dedicated myself to the study of the so-called early Indian Buddhist tradition, learning the Pali language and getting a PhD in philosophy focused on this material, and have since become, a professor of Buddhist philosophy with expertise in this area. I tend to try and practice around 2 hours a day of meditation, and it's been very transformative in positive and negative ways. I think that meditation as a part of path philosophy, which is a term that the Indian philosopher Karl Popper uses to describe classical Indian philosophy, is very profound, but not to be understood as a kind of tool. For me, being a serious meditator is kind of like being a parent, in the sense that I don't evaluate my child or my fatherhood as something good or bad. It's just a core feature of who I am. And similarly, being a meditator isn't about having this tool of mindfulness that I carry around with me to help me deal with situations. It's a core value and form of life, really, and which brings with it certain boons, certain benefits, and also certain costs. And for me, some of those benefits are self-awareness, certain degree of insight, I suppose, strong sense of self-knowledge, a sense of having an active relationship to more recessive parts of the mind that might otherwise escape conscious awareness, which brings with it certain heightened sense of agency and empathy, but tremendous costs as well. There have been really strange periods of heightened self-awareness that have made practical life very difficult. The combination of practicing meditation seriously with a disciplined philosophical acumen creates a sense of isolation sometimes, where people I know who are serious about meditation aren't really serious about philosophy, so you become too much the philosopher for the meditator. And certainly in many academic and philosophical settings, too much the Buddhist for the philosophers. And that has created a sort of idiosyncratic practical identity that has at times presented real challenges to living an integrated life. And so you have to take the good with the bad, at least in my own case. I don't claim to speak for anyone besides myself. But it's been I've had enough experience with it and enough different things happen that I thought it would be good to sort of open up an avenue here to discuss meditation. So if folks have questions or issues that they want to see addressed or that they'd like me to try and tackle around issues of meditation, I'd be happy to do so. Just let me know. Before I get into the two questions that I want to address in this video, I do want to say a bit about the tradition that I practice in, which is the householder tradition that was popularized by S.N. Goenka. These 10-day Vipassana retreats have become something of a global phenomenon. And on the whole, I think the tradition is a force for good in the world. I've benefited from being part of this tradition. Like any tradition, it has its blind spots, it has its problems, and I think that this is a tradition that very much understands its own boundaries and its own rules. And because of that, it's a little less porous than one on the outside might like in terms of interfacing with the wider world. The S.N. Goenka Vipassana tradition is quite self-enclosed, and their rules are quite strict. And so to fully participate, you have to absorb some of those rules, not all of which are, at least to my mind, maximally beneficial. Some of them are quite dogmatic. And saying that, again, you have to kind of make a choice about how the benefits or potential benefits weigh against some of the costs. So it is a very puritanical tradition. The self-understanding that tradition has is very purist. They really see themselves as holding the chalice of the Buddha's actual teachings. The tradition is deeply stitched in with a lot of Buddhist modernism. It understands itself to be teaching a purified science of mind. All the sorts of dogmas and narratives that Buddhist studies scholars diagnose under the problematic descriptor of Buddhist modernism. At the same time, it's a very rigorous tradition. There aren't a lot of stressors in the tradition in terms of teachers sleeping with students. It's very pure in that way. They run their centers purely on donation, which is more than a lot of traditions can say. It is a reliably transformative experience if you go and take one of these courses. And as someone who's deeply invested in embodied cognitive science, the technique they teach is precise and systematic and rigorous, and really take you deeply inside the somatic realities of embodied consciousness and help you directly experience some of the ways in which habitual reactions are encoded through feeling in the body, and how that structures your sense of agency, your sense of self, and your priorities. And any technique that takes you deep into the body and helps you understand the constitutive nature of your own embodiment as the vehicle for your consciousness is a technique worth developing. And this is the reason that I have stayed roughly within the purview of this tradition for so long and practiced seriously within it. That being said, it is monolithic in certain ways. I think the tradition has focused almost exclusively on spreading the technique around to as many people as possible, which has created certain difficulties in terms of helping people get to higher stages and for creating strong teacher-student relationships that are necessary for guidance at subtler stages. I myself reached certain impasses in my practice many, many years ago, and was sort of on my own in a number of ways, in spite of looking for help from various senior teachers. I was unable to really find the support I needed, and as a result sort of had to become my own support, which in a way is a benefit, right? That becoming independent of others in the practice of the path is a stage of development in Buddhist moral psychology. But it can be frightening. It can be frightening to be that deep into your own experience, that deep into your own living body, and to find yourself struggling a little bit with how to move forward, because sometimes when you open certain doors in the mind, it's hard to close them again, and the only way is to go forward, but it's not always clear what forward looks like. And I think a lot of people have struggled in that tradition to find their way once they get past a certain point. People get stuck, they get sort of locked into their own bodies in ways that is hard to reframe or move through. And I think that the training regimen of teachers in this tradition has been a little bit too simplified, maybe is the right word, so that the pedagogical infrastructure of the tradition, I think, has struggled to give full support to people who struggle with their practice. But as I say, any tradition will have its blind spots. I don't write them off for this reason. In fact, I consider myself a part of this tradition, in spite of being something of a critic of it. I've never been ostracized for that. And that's part of the reason why I stay, is that I'm able to speak my mind and to practice seriously and to get the benefits and to pay the costs. Because Buddhist meditation is a radical project. And the goals it aims for are quite transcendental, and this is not for the faint of heart. And so I think this is one of the places where I find that the modern proselytizing of mindfulness becomes a bit curious for me, because the way these techniques were originally deployed in their both Buddhist and non-Buddhist contexts was for the aim of a sort of radical transformation of one's moral psychology and sense of being. And while radical transformation is perhaps a laudable goal and one worth pursuing, it is not for the faint of heart. And there are stages along the way that are quite troubling and challenging to work with. And so for me, I've always been a little bit astounded at how sexy and popular Buddhism has become in the modern era, given that at its roots, it really does represent, both theoretically and practically, a very radical way of looking at things. So I can say more about that another time, perhaps. For now, what I want to do is note, I've heard from a lot of different people in my life, you know, they want to be good at meditation, they want to try meditating, but they're not good at I'm not good at meditation. I've heard this many times. And I've always found that to be very funny, because, you know, Buddhist meditation anyway, you know, usually, and this is very different, and I'm speaking very generally now, normally begins with a certain kind of anchoring of the attention on some part of the body or the breath, right? So for me, it's the breath right here, where it enters and leaves the nostrils. Some people focus on breath in the abdomen. There are lots of different places that people go, but normally the preliminary work of Buddhist meditation is to get the mind concentrated. And in order to concentrate the mind, you have to pick something, one thing, and to make the mind focus on that one thing while trying to progressively eliminate distractors. Now, when you start to do that work, you will fail at it most of the time. And this is one thing I think people who think they're not good at meditation need to keep in mind. You're supposed to fail, right? The habit of the mind is to move around. And that's a good habit to have if you're trying to avoid predators or find food, right? It's the fact that the mind is so able to move about and take different, you know, snapshots of its reality to get different parsings of its environment is part of a strategy that we've sort of inherited as the evolved beings that we are, to keep track of what's going on in the world around us. When we start practicing inner work, we're kind of cutting against the grain of that instinct in a lot of ways. Keeping the mind anchored on one thing and persistently and patiently bringing the mind back to one thing, even though its deepest ingrained habit is to dart about from one to another thing. That entails that for a lot of it, of what you're doing, you're going to not be doing what you've been instructed to do, right? So the instructions tell you, oh, pay attention to the breath naturally coming in and out of your nostrils, say. Well, if that's your task, you're going to fail at it most of the time. And they don't tell you that. And it's important to know, because the real work of practicing mindfulness of breathing, say, at the outset, isn't to succeed in anchoring the mind on one thing. It is to consistently forgive yourself for when the mind does the precise opposite of what you've set out to do. When you give yourself a task to which the mind is profoundly habituated in the opposite direction, you are setting yourself up for failure. And the work of the initial stages should be acceptance of this failure, the recognition that this failure is inevitable, and to softly and kindly try again. Just keep trying and failing and trying and failing. Because for me, even after 15 years of fairly dedicated practice, and long retreats of 10, 20, 30 days, multiple times, 2 hours a day of practice, I still struggle daily to keep my mind anchored on one thing. And when I succeed, I feels good, because when the mind calms down and you do manage to get it to center on one thing and no other things, there's a peace that comes, a calmness of mind, a concentration of mind, which they call samadhi. And it's good, it's wholesome. But it's hard fought, it's hard won. And in order to reach that stage, you have to engage in a process of self-forgiveness and self-kindness that allows the mind to wander and then to be gently brought back, to wander, to gently be brought back. That's the real work. So if you become too task-oriented, you will inevitably evaluate your progress as one of systematic failure. But the key is to reframe that failure, to recognize that that failure is perfectly natural. That failure is part of what it is to be a discursive mind. And that part of what you're trying to learn how to do is to reprogram your instincts a little bit so that your mind doesn't dart about as much, that it stays persistent. That takes ages, takes a lot of dedication, takes a lot of self-forgiveness. And then slowly, by degrees, the mind calms down, it gets stabilized on the chosen object of awareness, and it starts to experience things in a new way. But the only way you get to that stage is by being really nice to yourself about it. You're not bad at mindfulness, you're not bad at meditation, you're just getting started, which means learn to fail better. Learn to be really nice to yourself when you fail. That's a task that we could all take on, I think, in our own lives, not just in the context of practicing meditation, but in many things, because we fail so much. And being nice to ourselves when we fail is a skill that we could all, I think, learn to develop a bit more. But once the mind does get stable, once the mind does get anchored, and you start practicing more seriously, another problem arises. That is, once you get the mind under control and you start to pay attention to the remarkably subtle phenomena of your own breathing, say, as an example, it's not the only one, but it's just the one I know, so we'll keep it there for a minute. And then your own body. So in the Vipassana tradition of S.N. Goenka, we practice awareness of breath in this area of the body to get the mind concentrated and calm. And then when it comes time to practice Vipassana, we systematically move our awareness through the body, feeling all of the sensations inside and outside the body. And we recognize their consistently changing impermanent nature and try to develop an attitude of detached equanimity so that we're not chasing after the pleasant sensations, generating aversion to the unpleasant sensations and ignoring the neutral sensations. When you start to cultivate subtler thresholds of awareness of breath and body, you start to notice things you didn't notice before. You start feeling things you weren't feeling before, not just within yourself, but in others. You become a bit more empathic and you start to pick up on what's going on around you. And there's a real risk in this because the world as we normally experience it through our sensory receptors presents things as fairly discrete, and our perceptions kind of bound up all that information into easily digestible objects and other subjects. But once you start to recognize and feel viscerally within the framework of your own body, the way in which the breath and the sensations in the body kind of undergird the way perceptions and thoughts get formed. And therefore, you start to have some real-time, in-person, first personal rather, access to the somatic dimensions of experience that undergird the formations of discrete thoughts and perceptions. The boundaries between things start to get a little bit shakier, and the information that you're picking up becomes a little bit more unwieldy. There are thresholds of information exchange happening between your body and your world that you would not otherwise be aware of. And one of the risks that come with this is people, myself included, we start to develop what P.F. Strawson would call reactive attitudes to those sensations. We start to get really concerned about the energy in the room. We start to get really concerned about other people's vibes. And those are important thresholds of sensitivity that we can engage with. But the problem that lurks in the corner of this heightened awareness is that if we start becoming more reactive to subtler thresholds of information, we stand at very real risk of hurting ourselves, because there's an infinite amount of information. And you are being bombarded by it constantly, in fact. And once you become aware of that relentless process of information integration between your living body, your conscious introspective awareness, and your world, you're not processing the world with the same level of boundedness and discreteness and simplification that you had prior to having this awareness. And if your attitude towards it is reactive, you're going to generate a lot of agitation and misery for yourself, which is why in Goenka's teaching, and also I think, and this is a direct extension of a more broadly Buddhist outlook, the cultivation of detachment and equanimity is essential. Because if you don't have equanimity, if you aren't able to let go of all this, you're going to develop attachments. And the thing about subtler information, microvalences in your world, in your body, is that they're changing really fast all the time, almost constantly. And if you start to generate attachment to the pleasant sensations and aversion to the unpleasant sensations, and you start ignoring the neutral sensations, you're going to get even more agitated. Because before you were practicing, of course, you had aversion to unpleasant stimuli and craving for pleasant stimuli and indifference towards neutral stimuli. But your interpretation of what was going on relative to the sources of those stimuli were fairly bounded. It bounded up with objects in your environment and other subjects that you're interacting with. But once the information flow starts to become amorphous through a recognition of how the feelings in the body and the breath are kind of an underlying current upon which bounded discrete perceptions and thoughts are formed. If your reactive attitudes penetrate underneath the surface of perception and thought into the domain of embodied affect, and you start allowing your emotional attachments and reactions to become sensitive to that flow, you're going to be really agitated, because that flow is moving way too fast. And so you're going to get confused and stressed out. And this is one of the risks that come with getting too wrapped up in subtle energy and the weird pre-linguistic vibrations that bounce between living bodies when they're in communion with each other. And learning to start to consciously engage with that terrain is, the work of many different traditions of spiritual practice. But if your attitude towards that domain is reactionary, you're really going to hurt yourself, and you have to be careful. The wisdom that is prescribed by Buddhist traditions is to be, quiet and equanimous and detached from those flows, because if you follow them too much, they're going to take you back onto the roller coaster of samsara, right? And for some people, that's what they want. And in that case, like, ride the roller coaster and enjoy yourself. But it's a very intense roller coaster, and it's very difficult to negotiate if your reactive attitudes are unchecked. So in summary, I would say you're not doing it wrong. You just need to be nicer to yourself. And once you do it, once you're nice enough to yourself that things calm down, just be aware that there's a lot more happening within your mind and your body than ordinary untutored introspection would otherwise disclose. And gaining access to those subtler phenomena is a major piece of personal development that is lauded by, most contemplative traditions. But the kinds of attitudes we take to the phenomena that we start to encounter when things get a bit more subtle is really of paramount importance for maintaining psychological and emotional equilibrium. So as I mentioned at the outset, if anyone has any suggestions or questions that they'd like me to address regarding the practice of meditation, I'm happy to do so. I just wanted to sort of open this conversation up because I think it's one that I've been meaning to have for a long time, and it felt like it was time to address it on my own terms, and hopefully it will be of some use to some of you. Okay, take care. Good luck, everybody.